Good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast, a good morning to those on the Central and Pacific time zones. Those following from Israel, from Europe, I want to wish you a good evening. Today is actually an infamous day in Jewish history. It's known as Tzom Gedalia, the day that we fast. It's a day that Jews across the world fast in commemoration of one of the most tragic events in Jewish history. And the reason it's called the most tragic event is because it was a Jew, the Jewish governor, who was appointed by the Babylonians to oversee the community still remaining in Israel that had not been exiled to Iraq, exiled to Babylonia. His name was Gedalia ben Achikam. And Gedalia was assassinated. He was executed by fellow Jews, by Jews themselves who wanted to be in control and power, who viewed him as a puppet of the Babylonians. And the reason it's a tragic day is you don't want to have a situation where a Jew turns against another Jew. That's the worst of all scenarios. And it's a situation, that obviously we're keenly aware of in terms of some of the vitriol, some of the issues going on with some of the protests in Israel that we're trying our best to be sensitive to. Today, I want to take a step back and look at the past year. As all of us know, we're in the period known as Yamim Noraim, the days of awe. They're really the days of introspection. Rosh Hashanah is not the beginning of the creation of the universe. Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of the creation of humanity as we know it. And on that day, and during this period, culminating with Yom Kippur, the Jewish world goes through a catharsis, goes through an introspection, goes through a reflection. And we look at it as individuals, as a community, as a nation. Ultimately, we look at who we are, what have we been. And this past year has been a tragic year. It's been a horrific year. On the other hand, it's been a year of heroism. It's been a year in many quarters of unity. It's been a year of growth. And it's been a year in which we've been able to literally snatch victory from the clutches of defeat. When we look at what happened on October 7th and what could have happened on October 7th, when 6,000 people, 6,000 human beings, if you could call them that, came into our homes, into our communities, raped our women, burnt alive our children, beheaded our family members. Barbarism that the world has not seen for centuries was perpetrated by the Palestinians upon the Jewish people, upon communities that stood for peace, communities that had extended themselves and brought Palestinians in for medical treatment, given them jobs, given them the opportunity to grow. And those very Palestinians who helped Hamas create maps, who came across the border, were the ones who perpetrated the evil, an evil that is unspeakable on the Jewish people. And we saw a world, controlled and manipulated by some very evil people, taking American college students who had no education, no context, no desire to seek out and search for truth, and use them as the useful idiots against the Jewish people. It was American campuses, European campuses, American media, American social media. And for those who, until this point, looked at Jewish history and said, we've never had a diaspora like the experiences we've had in the United States and Canada. By far the most glorious diaspora ever in Jewish history. And that was all true until this past year. And now in America, we are reverting back to the historical norm, where the Jew is a pariah. There's always a double standard against the Jew. And where they can't even hide the anti-Semitism as being anti-Israel or anti-Zionism. It's clear to anyone with half a brain, with a quarter of a brain, that it's anti-Semitism. anti-Semitism that we're seeing, particularly from the left. The far-right anti-Semitism was something that was known, that is limited. But the progressive movement, the woke movement in this country, with its hypocrisy and its double standards, it's been very, very disheartening. And for many Jews this past year, an earthquake has happened in their lives. Literally, the ground underneath them has opened up and swallowed them up. So for many Jews, it's been a very cathartic year. Because to quote one Jew, this is my second life. My first life, I worshiped, I prayed at the altar of whatever the theme of the month was in progressive America. That was where I worshiped. And I understand that the world that I invested in, I'd given my life to movements like Black Lives Matter. Those very movements turned on me. They turned on me, they stabbed me in the back and in the heart. And that's a quote. And for them, it's been an opportunity to come back to their tradition, to come back and look at Jewish history, to come back to their people, and to appreciate that the IDF is the most moral army, not just on the globe. The IDF is the most moral, ethical army in the history of humanity. And tiny little Israel, with all of its warts and pimples, is a beacon of light, a beacon of morality, and a beacon of decency. It's the one place on earth that Muslim women have a chance to get an education and can ultimately fulfill their dream and can be treated like a human being with equal rights. It's a place where you have a Muslim minority, 20% of the population, yet the Muslims make up 33% of the medical students in Israeli universities. And if it means that Jewish students to become a doctor will have to travel abroad and go to medical schools in Eastern Europe, so be it. It's a country where it looks after its minorities and everyone receives a chance. It's an army where first priority go to those minorities, be they Muslims, Christians, or Druze. It's a beacon of light. It's a beacon of ethics. But when they see that so clear and so obvious, but yet the spin, the manipulation of the world, when you had a Hezbollah that has the ability to eradicate Israel from the state of Israel, and the Israeli security forces addressed that terrorist threat through communications devices where those Hezbollah terrorists were affected. But yet, those people bent on the annihilation and murder of the Israeli people, yet you've got people running around the world condemning Israel for that. Never ever in history has there been a more targeted strike where there was no collateral damage. And yet, you have a condemnation from the world. You have an army right now that never in history has there been as little collateral damage. But yet, like a bunch of blind idiots, the world just accepts the lies and the false numbers that even the United Nations acknowledges have no basis in reality, that are spewed out by Hamas as to how many people have been killed. And no one acknowledges that those numbers have no basis in reality. And even if you use those false numbers, Israel will go down as the most moral army in the history of humanity. So it's been disheartening for those in the West, be it the United States, Canada, be it Western Europe. But on the other hand, let's look at this year. We have seen a heroism. We have seen a morality. We have seen a conviction amongst these young Israeli Jews, amongst these young Israeli Druze, fighting side by side with the Jews, that no one could ever have imagined. Israel was not built for a 12-month war, but yet, after 12 months, Hamas has been defeated. Yes, they exist as terrorists. And yes, they will continue to exist for years as terrorists. But they've been defeated as an army. They've been defeated as a vehicle that can perpetrate the evil, the horrors of October 7th, of the Black Simchas Torah. And when everyone said from day one, I'm talking about the IDF, preparing for potentially 1,800 fatalities, having to fight in booby-trapped buildings and booby-trapped tunnels. And we lost many to IEDs. We lost many to booby traps. But right now, on the ground war, we've lost less than 400. And that's a huge number. It's a huge number. But it's not the 1,800 that we feared. What's happened in Lebanon over the course of the last 3 weeks is nothing beyond miraculous. Miraculous of biblical proportions. That's what we've had this year. And today, Israel is a much safer place. Today, Israel is a far safer place than it was last Rosh Hashanah. There's a long way to go. And when I say long, it will take a long time. But the threat of the launchers, again, using Ari Sasher's analogy, you can have a cupboard full of walnuts, but if you don't have a nutcracker, then how do you eat the walnuts? They still have an excess of 100,000 rockets that they could use against Israel. But the infrastructure of rocket launchers is being dismantled so that before we have to dismantle the rockets, we've prevented them from barraging thousands of rockets a day on Israel in a scenario that the missile defense couldn't handle, that would overwhelm the missile defense. Right now, they're still shooting rockets, but they're in the tens, that the missile defense can protect the country and that Jews can live and not be destroyed. Those 12 children, those 12 Bedouin children that were destroyed playing soccer, we can prevent that from happening again. Jews, please God, will be able to move back to the north. Those 70,000 refugees can return to their homes. Many of those homes, it will take years to rebuild, but the majority of those homes are standing. And communities, please God, soon will be able to return with the dismantling of the Hezbollah and their capabilities. It's a year that started off in a horrifically dark place. And it's a year that has ended in a very, very bright place, providing safety to Israel and its citizens, dismantling the abilities of the enemies. And let's reflect on that year. It's a year where, from a charitable point of view, from a point of view of care and concern, we know that in Israel, there's no family that wasn't affected by this. There's no family that didn't lose a close friend or relative. We've created a world today as a function of Hamas and Hezbollah, where we have 200 brand new widows, 500 brand new orphans. We have close to 1,500 brand new siblings who have lost an older brother or older sister. We've got well over 700 families that have buried a soldier, a son or a daughter. And that's not even referring to the civilian toll. What's happened to the civilian population? More than 30 civilians killed on the northern front. More than 900 civilians killed on the southern front. And that doesn't even begin to talk about the pain of the families of the hostages. Those who know that their loved one is dead and don't even have a body to bury. And those who don't even know, don't know is their son, their daughter, their mother, their father alive or dead. And what they go through every time the phone goes off. Is this a call of notification? Israel, to quote many of the psychologists, has gone from startup nation to PTSD nation. That's on one hand. But on the other hand, Israel, the Jewish world, the Christian Zionist world, has come together in a way like no one could imagine. The challahs that have been baked, the flowers that have been sent, the hugs that have been given, the funds that have been raised, the support where people who don't have a background, psychologists and social workers who don't have a background in PTSD. I know because we funded the training of more than 300 of them at this point, so that they can spend their life bringing healing, that there won't be a repeat of what happened to the soldiers after the Yom Kippur War, that these soldiers will have the chance to heal, to deal with the dangers of PTSD, and to function as functional husbands, as functional fathers, as functional employees, employers in the workplace, being able to hold down a job. The care, the support to those who've lost a limb, the support to those who are learning how to walk again, the job places which have kept jobs of people who've been out of work for months, either because they've been on the battlefield or because they've been in recuperation. The incredible job the Army's done of protecting its soldiers. The last time Israel fought a war, 15% of anyone who was hit died of their wounds. Today, that number is in half. They've cut it in half. The time from the time that a soldier is wounded till they end up in the hospital is averaging 54 minutes. The nation, a nation of compassion, a nation of love, a nation of giving, a nation of empathy, and a nation of sympathy. What we have seen is superhuman. And who are the superhumans? The regular men and women. The bravery, the sacrifice that took place on October 7th. The sacrifice that's taking place for the bereaved families, for the families of the wounded. It's a year of chesed. It's a year of tzedakah. It's been a year of rachmanut, of sympathy, of chananut, of empathy. We've seen great things. Ordinary people have become extraordinary people. Ordinary people have done extraordinary kindnesses. And we can be proud. We can be proud of the men and women of Israel. Proud of these incredibly moral soldiers, of these soldiers who've put their whole life on hold to defend their country. And proud of its citizens who are looking after each other the way family is meant to look after each other. At this time of year, we quote the Talmud. We quote a famous piyut, a famous liturgical prayer written by an Israeli Jew. His name was Yanai, probably lived in either the 8th or 9th century in northern Israel, when most Jews did not live in Israel. Most Jews lived on the Fertile Crescent in Iraq. And he wrote a prayer called Unesana Tokef. The Jewish community in the German Rhineland was a very significant, it was the most important, significant community in terms of the Jewish tradition, what we refer to as the Masorah, the intellectual Jewish world, even though it was a very small community. Bonn, Kuhn, Mainz, Worms, Spires, all of those communities along the Rhine River in Germany, which at that time wasn't called Germany, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And there was a Rav Amnon of Mainz You can go to the cemetery today in Mainz and to go to his grave. He was abducted by the priest, by the archbishop, and he was told, you can do it in a positive way, or we can do it in a very harsh way. We want you to convert to Christianity, to become a Trinitarian. Rav Amnon had no intention of converting, but he asked the bishop for 3 days. 3 days to get his life in order, to get the community in order before he would ultimately sacrifice himself. And he regretted that, because in the mind of the bishop, in the mind of the priests, in the mind of the nuns, in the mind of the Catholic community, they assumed that he actually wanted to think it over. And he wanted to weigh the possibility of abandoning being a monotheist and adopting Trinitarian worship. And what they did to him, they literally removed his legs, his arms. The brutal death they did to Rav Amnon was horrific. But in his last words, he asked of the community, as he was dying, bleeding to death from the various removal of limbs. He asked the community if they would say the prayer on Rosh Hashanah that Jews in Israel were saying, that possibly Jews in North Africa and other parts of the world that had not come onto the European continent. The famous prayer, Unetana Tokef. And because of this, Rav Amnon, there's not an Ashkenazic Jew anywhere on earth today that doesn't say this prayer. Not only the first day of Rosh Hashanah, it said, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, it said Yom Kippur. It's one of the prayers that everyone remembers. It talks about the awesomeness of the day of judgment. It talks about who this year will die by fire, who by drowning, who will live, who will be healthy, who will be sick, who will suffer financial ruination, who will have a turnaround economically and do well. And it goes through various dimensions of our life. And the rest of the prayers, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, are more abstract, more ethereal, more sublime. This is very raw, very clear, very tangible, and very concrete. And it gets quoted all the time. When Jimmy Carter, during the Camp David Accords, Prime Minister Menachem Begin was staying in the Blair House. Jimmy Carter didn't just want to discuss the Sinai Desert. He didn't want to just discuss those details. Jimmy Carter called him Menachem. He couldn't pronounce Menachem, so he called him Menachem. He wanted Menachem to give up Jerusalem. Jimmy Carter couldn't stand the fact that Jerusalem, after 2,000 years of exile, was once again in Jewish hands. How could the holy city of Jerusalem be under the control of the Jews? The Jews who had been rejected, the Jews who, because they did not adopt Jimmy Carter's savior, had been condemned to eternal damnation and rejected. Couldn't tolerate that. And he tried to convince Menachem Begin, the prime minister, about rescinding and about giving up the holy sites in Jerusalem. And Prime Minister Begin said, absolutely not. He said, there's nothing to discuss. So President Carter said to him, why don't you think about it? Let's think about it for a day or two and let's have a conversation. And that's when Prime Minister Menachem Begin, he invoked the prayer of the Payatan Yanai, the prayer that Rav Amnon brought to the Ashkenazic Jewish world, Unetana Tokef. And he said that Rav Amnon, just by even giving the hint or giving the thought to the archbishop and to the Catholic leadership, that he would think for a few days about the proposal of abandoning his tradition, his monotheistic worship. For that, he felt that he had done a terrible wrong. And he says, I cannot even give it a minute's thought that when God, after 2 millennia, brought us back to our ancestral homeland, after 2 millennia of being refugees, in 1967 gave us our holy city back, that I would even think or give you the impression that we're thinking of selling out the holy city. He invoked Unetana Tokef. He invoked that famous prayer. When we look at that prayer, last year, standing before God on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, could we have imagined what had happened to our babies, our women, our children who attended the music festival, our community's salt of the earth, Be'eri, Kfar Aza, Nativa Asara, the young women, the Tatzpitaniot, the women who are looking at the computer screens, tracking the drones and tracking the satellites over Gaza, that they would be incinerated, that 5 of them, we don't know if they're alive or dead, are still being held in Gaza. We could have never dreamed of this. On the other hand, Mi Yarum Mi Yishafel, who will be brought low, who will be raised up? This generation, the generation that we thought, that we referred to as the TikTok generation, as Generation Z, they will stand with the greatest of generations in the way they responded to what happened on that Black Simchas Torah, October 7th. And how for 11 months they've been fighting in tunnels and booby-trapped homes, fighting against a vicious enemy that uses children and elderly as human shields. And they've maintained their integrity. Mi Arum. How have they been lifted up in our eyes? The awe, the respect, the gratitude we have to them. It's been a year, in terms of our lifetime, like no other year. We probably have not seen a year like this since 1967, the Six-Day War. We haven't seen a year like this since 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And we pray, and we yearn, and we commit ourselves to being charitable, to being humble, to being moral, to being ethical, to doing tshuva, to repenting in terms of refining ourselves, refining our actions, refining our speech as we face Yom Kippur. But with that being said, we have a lot to be grateful for this year. We have a lot to be proud of this year. And we have a lot to be thankful for this year. 3 weeks ago, could anyone have imagined what had become of the political leadership, the military leadership, the infrastructure, the communication systems, the rocket systems, the ballistic missile systems throughout this country of Lebanon, not just in southern Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley or south of the Litani River, but throughout the length and breadth of Lebanon? And look what's become of Hezbollah. No one could have imagined that 3 weeks ago. And yet that's what's become of it. So it's a time of reflection. And I want to end by thanking each and every one of you. As I reflect, 112,000 unique donors. That's 112,000 unique families in 2023. This year alone, 70,000 unique families. We've turned to you, and we have huge responsibilities, huge commitments I mentioned the $26 million we've committed to the bereaved families that we have not raised yet. Now the commitment for PTSD is 110 million. 110 million. It used to be 90 million. Because we've embarked upon some very groundbreaking work in terms of providing therapy to the families who are living with these soldiers. The commitment we've made to education, over $20 million, to funding scholarships and spending money for those soldiers coming out of poverty, for those soldiers coming from low middle class families, and so much more. Ambulances, field hospitals, EKG machines, X-ray machines, medical equipment right now for the Home Front Command, Pikud Oref. They're the ones that have the orange kumtaz, the orange berets, who are going to be managing the home front as these rockets keep coming. We can't thank you enough. There's no way we can give you proper gratitude. And on the other hand, I look you in the face and I ask you for more. And I ask you to help us fulfill. We've got $40 million of commitments that we have not raised the funds for. Feel free to reach out to my email, steve.weil@fidf.org, steve.weil@fidf.org, or feel free to go to our website, fidf.org. I thank you, and at the same time, I ask of you to help us support these soldiers, to help us fulfill the wishes of the Ministry of Defense, of the General Staff, to give them the most critical support, be it the therapy, be it the healing, be it looking after those who've made the ultimate sacrifice, who've sacrificed a father, a spouse, a child, a sibling, and also to help us fund the welfare. Many of these 50,000 soldiers are coming from poverty. Help us fund their needs. And I want to wish for you and your families a year of growth, a year of peace, a year of health, a year of success, a year in which you can give to others, a year in which you can help others, and a year that ultimately Israel will be acknowledged for what it is, an incredible, ethical, moral beacon of light in a very challenged world. In a year in which that challenged world will have some moral clarity, will have some ethical clarity, and we'll look back and say, these soldiers were not just protecting their home front. They were not just protecting their citizens. They were on the front line protecting the Sunni Muslims from the Shia hegemonic caliphate. They were not just protecting the Sunni Muslims. They were the ones on the front lines protecting Western civilization, protecting Christian Europe and Christian America from an evil that, if left unbridled, will destroy the world. Because that is what the Shia hegemonic caliphate is bent upon. They have their tentacles on every continent. And their ultimate goal is not Jerusalem. Their ultimate goal is not even Mecca and Medina. Their ultimate goal is the downfall of Western civilization, the downfall of Christian Europe and Christian America. That's who these soldiers are protecting. And when the world sees that and appreciates it, and the world understands that, only then will there be a moral clarity. Only then will they understand how Israel and how its soldiers have sacrificed for humanity and for humankind. And with that, may we please God have a special year, a year of blessing, a year of peace, a year of safety and security. All the best, and we'll see you next week.